Mother, what are you doing? When we returned from shopping, what we saw was a moving company parked in front of our house and the site of my in-laws. My mother-in-law glanced at me in surprise and continued to give instructions to the movers. You're a nuisance. Please do not enter someone else's house without permission. You're being insolent. Open the door quickly. My father-in-law said this and reached for my bag. I hugged my bag and backed away. Seeing this, my mother-in-law laughed mockingly and continued speaking. Strangers should leave quickly, haha. At my mother-in-law's words, I was so dumbfounded that I couldn't respond. However, hearing this, Robert was visibly shaken and trembling. Mom, don't you know? What? At this moment, I thought it was the right time to tell the truth. Determined, I decided to confront my shouting mother-in-law with the truth. My name is Gina Anderson. I am 48 years old and run an insurance agency. This company was started by my father and I took it over. Being strict and meticulous, the job of tailoring insurance to the needs of clients was the perfect job for me. I have good relations with long-time clients from when my father was running the company, and thankfully, the business is doing well. I met my husband Robert through work when I was 30. A long-time customer of my father introduced him to me, which led to an invitation for a cafe. That's how it all started. Robert was 2 years older than me, a very calm and dignified person. He had recently broken up with a long-term girlfriend who had cheated on him. After just a brief conversation, we hit it off immediately and exchanged contacts. Soon after, we started going out. At that time, my mother was ill, and wanting to fulfill her dream of seeing me in a wedding dress, I was actively seeking marriage. Meanwhile, Robert was not in a hurry to marry. Nevertheless, he respected my wishes, and 6 months after we met, he proposed to me. With tears of joy, I expressed my gratitude to him. Thank you. I look forward to our life together. After that, we quickly paid respects to both families and had a family-only wedding ceremony. My mother was very happy to see me in my wedding dress. The following month, she passed away quietly. It was thanks to Robert that I was able to fulfill my mother's last wish. Remembering how Robert supported me even at my mother's funeral, I resolved to cherish him for the rest of my life. Even after 5 years of marriage, we had no children. We thought of children as a gift from God and were not in a rush, but it was my in-laws who intervened. This happened during Christmas. Initially, Robert was reluctant to visit, but when my mother-in-law contacted me asking, "Why haven't you come over?" we had no choice but to go. Still no baby? When will you show us a grandchild? Mom, we've decided not to rush things. If this is going to be the topic of discussion, we're leaving. I understand that, but maybe the problem lies with Gina. Don't insult her. Sorry, Gina, we're leaving. We were supposed to come for Christmas, but at the entrance, the conversation suddenly turned to grandchildren, and Robert quickly took me away from the scene. It was I who had persuaded him to come with me. Yet, as soon as we got back to the car, Robert apologized to me. I'm really sorry for putting you through this. I'm fine, Robert. I just feel bad that you're having a hard time. I don't mind. It's my parents after all. But now, you are my family. If they hurt you, I'm willing to cut ties with them, even if they are my parents. But it's okay. I've actually been distancing myself from them since I became an adult. As Robert spoke, a look of loneliness appeared on his face, and all I could do was respond with a simple yeah. Afterward, Robert made an effort to keep a distance between me and his parents, and we decided to move. There were numerous calls asking for our address, but Robert ignored them all. For about 13 years, I managed to live without seeing my in-laws except at weddings and funerals. By the time I was over 40, my in-laws rarely mentioned grandchildren, and I felt a bit relieved. However, one day, seemingly due to a leak of information, my in-laws showed up at our home. Robert happened to be out with a friend, and knowing I was alone, my in-laws forcefully entered the house and began inspecting it. Oh my! Both of you are still sleeping in the same bed at your age? That's rather indecent. Robert won't be satisfied with the underwear I found in this laundry. Ignoring my displeased expression, my in-laws continued to rummage through the room. They even ate the food we had stored and complained while going through our drawers. This is why you haven't had grandchildren. Well, honey, it's too early to give up. Look. Saying this, my in-laws pulled out a crumpled newspaper from their bag and handed it to me. The newspaper article was about a woman who became a mother at the age of 60. Realizing their intent, I felt a chill run down my spine. Maybe we've been too lenient until now. There are people who have children at your age, you know? How about you move in with us? I'm back. Did someone come over? My father came home in the middle of my mother-in-law's preaching. Ever since moving to this house, Robert had suggested living with my father. Robert cared deeply for my father, and my father doted on Robert as if he were his own son. We had not told my in-laws about this fact, so they were surprised to see my father enter the house. I can't believe it, you're letting Robert take care of your father as well. Normally, you should first show gratitude to the husband's parents. My in-laws said this as if it were obvious, nodding in agreement. I was at a loss for how to respond. I appreciate your help. Really, I never thought a father would intrude into the house our son got married into. Doesn't our son taking care of you hurt your own pride? Well, yeah. My father responded with a smile and an ambiguous reply. His attitude only irritated my in-laws further. Dad, Mom, how did you find this place? Robert, who had returned home early because a friend fell ill, was standing at the entrance of the living room, yelling furiously. While Robert openly displayed his anger, my mother-in-law responded calmly. Since we couldn't get any information from you, we had to hire a detective. It was expensive. You need to pay for it. There's no way I can pay for that. Saying this, Robert strode over to my mother-in-law with heavy footsteps and grabbed her clothes forcefully. He then forcibly made her stand up, dragged her out of the room, and took her outside. Stop it. It hurts. What are you doing? Robert, can't you see Mom is in pain? Stop it. My mother-in-law screamed in a high pitch, and following her voice, my father-in-law's angry shouts could be heard. However, Robert, undeterred, took her to the entrance and pushed her out of the house. Don't ever step foot in this house again. I intend to sever our ties. Is this Gina's doing? What kind of daughter-in-law is she? Gina has nothing to do with it. It's my decision. Please leave. While my mother-in-law was still shouting something, Robert threatened to call the police, and she reluctantly dispersed. Afterward, Robert came to apologize to me and my father. I'm really sorry. To think they'd even hire a detective. I didn't take appropriate actions towards you as well. No, it's not your fault. However, I understand for sure that you are a wonderful person. Let's enjoy dinner together. Father, I appreciate it. Robert repeated his words of gratitude and conversed with my father with tears in his eyes. That night, the three of us had a pleasant time dining together. After our discussion, we decided to proceed with a certain plan. I thought my in-laws might visit again the next day, but weeks passed and they did not appear, and it seemed our life continued to be peaceful. Then, a month after my father passed away, while Robert and I were returning from a short trip, a call came from my mother-in-law. I'm in front of the house. Open up quickly. Confused, I replied, we'll head back home now, so please wait. And my husband and I hurried home, but no one was in front of the house. Feeling this was strange, we decided to rush to another location. Mother, what are you doing? In front of us, there were movers unloading boxes and my in-laws. My mother-in-law glanced at me, surprised, and continued giving instructions to the movers. You're a nuisance. Please do not enter someone else's house without permission. You're being insolent. Open the door quickly. My father-in-law said this and reached for my bag. I hugged my bag and backed away. Seeing this, my mother-in-law laughed mockingly and continued speaking. Strangers should leave quickly, haha. At my mother-in-law's words, I was so dumbfounded that I couldn't respond. However, hearing this, Robert was visibly shaken and trembling. Mom, don't you know? What? At this moment, I thought it was the right time to tell the truth. Determined, I decided to confront my shouting mother-in-law with the truth. This is my house, you know? What are you saying? Isn't it the house Robert bought? How shameless can you be? My mother-in-law looked at me with confusion and glared. When I looked at Robert, he took a deep breath and began to speak. This is Gina's house. I'm just staying here. Actually, we've recently moved close by and now Gina uses this place as her office. Robert, is Gina blackmailing you? Poor thing. There's no need for such obvious lies. I know Gina is just a housewife. What? Robert looked up at my mother-in-law with a surprised expression. She was furious, believing I had some leverage over him, but what upset her most was her assumption that I was merely a housewife. What do you mean Gina is just a housewife? Gina runs an insurance agency. What are you talking about? She's always home. And yet she's always going out to spas or just having fun. Recently, she was even dining with some strange man at a fancy restaurant. It's disgraceful. The strange man she mentioned was likely my business partner. Recently, an old client of my late father contacted me to reminisce over lunch. It was lunch at a hotel. Originally, Robert was supposed to join, but he had work and I ended up going alone. Of course, we also discussed a new insurance plan, so it wasn't entirely a private matter, and Robert had agreed to it beforehand. If they had hired a detective, they should have known that I returned home alone after lunch. Still, the reason they are so definitively accusing me must be because they want to break us up. That person is also a client of Gina's. I just couldn't join her that day because I had work. We do dine together sometimes. Robert, you are being deceived. It's not too late to start over. Find a younger wife and have children. I can't imagine marrying anyone else but Gina, and besides, I wouldn't be able to have children with anyone else anyways. What do you mean? Both my mother and father-in-law were stunned by his outburst, and I was frozen, unable to comprehend what was happening. Neither Robert nor I had undergone any fertility tests. We avoided them because if one of us had an issue, it would lead to unnecessary blame. A few years ago, when I had a prolonged fever, a doctor recommended some tests, and I secretly went through them. The results showed that I am biologically unable to have children. I've been worried that if I told Gina, she might leave me. I would never leave you just because we can't have children. I know, but I couldn't help feeling anxious. Hearing this, I instinctively embraced Robert tightly. Robert reciprocated the hug. I vowed to cherish Robert even more from now on. What do you mean you can't have children? Are you flawed? You've been deceiving us all this time. My in-laws continued to berate Robert as if I wasn't there. Robert looked back at them coldly. I've always said that I am not your tool. It's not right for a parent to call their own child flawed. What's wrong with calling something flawed that is flawed? My mother-in-law's anger was evident as she grabbed Robert's clothes and confronted him. At that moment, Robert quietly muttered a man's name. Hearing the name, my mother-in-law lost color in her face and immediately let go of Robert. Who's that? I wonder? Looking bewildered, my father-in-law was confused, and mother-in-law could no longer hide her agitation. Robert calmly responded, "That is the name of my actual biological father." What? What are you talking about? I'm your father. Until recently, I didn't know myself. Just like you guys once hired a detective, I did the same. The results were quite shocking. As Robert said this, he fiddled with his smartphone and showed the screen to my father-in-law. My mother-in-law's face had already turned pale. Upon seeing the screen, my father-in-law's face reddened with anger and he began to tremble. Are you saying you cheated on me? That man is Robert's real father? For 50 years? That's not it. How is it not? There are photos of you two embracing. How do you explain that? Ignoring the loud argument that erupted between my in-laws, Robert and I instructed the movers to transfer their belongings to a nearby storage unit, though there was an extra fee. It was my in-laws who would pay. Since they had caused the situation, it was only natural they bear some of the cost. Gee, so I've been raising someone else's child? The thought of spending money on someone who isn't even my blood, someone defective, sends chills down my spine. Robert, you take responsibility and support me. What? No way. Why not? You have a duty to. As my father-in-law attempted to lash out at Robert, Robert gently pushed him aside and smiled. The one who should take responsibility is just my mom. I was only brought into this world, and besides, you guys didn't pay for my high school or college tuition. I've been supporting myself with part-time jobs since high school. How dare you say such a thing? What should I say to a dad who even took my hard-earned money? I couldn't even hang out with friends because I was busy earning tuition? It became clear why Robert particularly despised his father among his parents. However, my father-in-law acted as if it were his right. It's a parent's job to manage the money earned by their children. And the same goes for the money earned by a child's spouse. As I said, we're not related by blood. Are you talking about what's on paper? If you want to cut ties so badly, then pay back all the money you've used up till now. It's already been repaid. I've been sending money every month. What? Monthly remittances. It was a well-known fact that Robert had been sending money to his parents' home. He also paid more than the demanded amount to ensure my in-laws did not interfere in our lives. Still, it seemed my father-in-law was unaware of the remittances. Look, I've been sending $1,500 every month. $1,500 every month. What is this? Oh, now I get it. All the money I sent was used up by Mom and her lover. What? My mother-in-law was so shaken that she could not respond. Seeing this, my father-in-law approached her and slapped her across the face. My shocked mother-in-law looked back at him and screamed in anger. What are you saying? You should be grateful that a man with no money or status like you got to marry me at all. That man has both money and status. The less I thought about divorcing you, the more I could enjoy my time with him. I even let you raise his child. You should be thankful. That's a joke. I agreed to marry you because you said you were pregnant, and I was ready to be beaten up by your father. Yes, but what's the problem? I would have felt sorry if that man was beaten up. In response to this, my father-in-law was at a loss for words and stood dumbfounded. Just then, my mother-in-law's cell phone rang loudly. She looked at her phone, her face brightened, and she answered in a sweet voice. Hello, darling. Did you miss me? This sweet tone, which I had never heard before, gave me goosebumps. Robert, too, watched with a look of disbelief, yet a grin began to form at the corner of his mouth. The meaning behind this would soon become clear. Not darling. His wife. How what? Oh, no, this is a misunderstanding. Full amount, compensation. 1 million. Please wait. My mother-in-law was flustered on the phone, but it seemed the caller hung up immediately, leaving her in a state of shock. Robert began to laugh quietly. All the photos and recordings, they've all arrived. What? This was also your doing. It's about sharing information. Oh, and by the way, she has no intention of leaving him. He married into her family, and it's going to be tough for him from now on. Married into her family. Didn't you know? Apparently, he has several other mistresses too. His wife had asked him to keep his affairs limited to younger women. He might be getting scolded by her right now. Haha. He has mistresses, but he told me he loved only me. Hearing this shocking revelation, my mother-in-law collapsed into a seat. My father-in-law looked down at her with satisfaction, then, as if struck by a sudden idea, proposed to Robert. I know it's tough with a mother like this, but I'll forget this incident. Let's put some distance between you and her and have you, me, and Gina live together. Gina, I'll help you wash your back later. Stay away from Gina. Ignoring Robert's anger, my father-in-law approached me. The moment his hand touched my shoulder, I grabbed it and threw him to the ground. Ow! What are you doing? While my father-in-law was confused about what had happened, I looked down at him with cold eyes. I had learned self-defense from a young age, prepared for unpredictable situations at work. Selling insurance, even to corporations, can involve unpredictable clients. I started this training as a condition set by my father when I took over the company, and I continued it even after taking over the company, eventually enjoying the training. I had thought it might be excessive to act against a 75-year-old father-in-law, but seeing Robert looking down at him with satisfaction, I felt relieved. My father-in-law was speechless with shock, but in that moment, my mother-in-law spoke to me. Gina, you are truly amazing. I always thought you could do anything. About the compensation for his wife, Could you cover it? Living together would help our finances, and I'll help with the housework. Have you considered adopting a child? I'd take good care of them. There's no way that will happen. This house, filled with memories of my father and Robert, is not for someone like you. Why should I pay the compensation? Pay it yourself. I could speak my mind to my mother-in-law straightforwardly since I had just physically rebuffed my father-in-law. Having never directly confronted her before, she was initially stunned but quickly became enraged. How dare you speak to your husband's mother like that? I've already told the neighbors we're moving in, and I've actually started demolishing that house already. That's right, we have nowhere to live now. So instead of her, take me in. What are you saying? I am your real mother. It's only natural that we live together. As my father-in-law stood up to argue and my mother-in-law counted him, Robert calmly stated our decision. We won't live with either of you. We've decided to cut ties. If you keep this up, I'll call the police. The police. This statement caused my in-laws to become pale and retreat, arguing all the way to the station. Later, my in-laws ended up divorcing, but neither had the financial means to live separately and continued to live under the same roof. My father-in-law demanded compensation from my mother-in-law and her lover, but he also faced a claim from the lover's wife, which ultimately offset each other. My mother-in-law, with little work experience and a habit of quitting jobs over minor grievances, struggled daily. Meanwhile, my father-in-law barely managed to earn enough for both, barely making ends meet. The lover had been squeezed dry, lost his position as the next company president, and was now essentially under house arrest. After enduring a 50-year-long affair, his wife was unforgiving and intended to take everything she could from him. Despite everything, Robert recovered surprisingly quickly and regained his spirits. The lover's family had offered him to take over the family business because of their blood relation, but Robert filed a document renouncing the inheritance, saying, "It's too much of a burden for me." I felt like the Robert, who disliked competition and was not greedy at all, was his true character, and while I felt a twinge of sadness, I was also pleased by it. Recently, a client offered me a cat they had found, and now I am excitedly researching cat towers. The cat's name will be Maureen, chosen for the memories of my father and Robert fishing together, and because of the cat's sea blue eyes. Robert seems somewhat excited too, looking forward to welcoming our new family member. The doorbell rings, signaling the arrival of the client. It's time for our first meeting with our new family member. Nervously, I head to the door and, with a welcoming hello, I open it.
I never imagined being told by my parents, who adore my genius sister, that I was no longer needed. Having one child is enough. We don't need a failure like you. Sandy needs a lot of money to bloom her talents, so if you can pay the monthly rent of $1,000, we might reconsider. My parents decided to kick me out of the house while I was still young. My uncle reached out to help me, unable to hide my confusion. "Though I'm poor, if you don't mind, Emily, I'd really like to be your parent," he said. I immediately accepted his offer. My name is Emily. I am now 30 years old, but my life has a complex background. Before talking about my family environment, please listen to my story. I was born to a typical salaryman father and a stay-at-home mother. We lived with my grandparents in my father's family home, where my unmarried uncle also lived. I started living with my uncle when I was 4 years old. He was 24 at the time. Living at home at that age might not be so unusual. However, my uncle had special circumstances that kept him from leaving home. He had been frail since childhood and continued to have health problems as an adult, making it difficult for him to hold a steady job, so he ended up living a life of irregular part-time work. Working just a few hours a few days a week was not enough income to live on his own. Perhaps feeling inferior because he was dependent on his parents, my uncle always looked guilty. I frequently witnessed my father yelling at my uncle, "You really are a burden." Such incidents were limited to when my grandparents were not around. My grandparents loved both their healthy son and their frail son without discrimination. With decreased income due to the recession and being forced to live together, my father seemed to want to behave modestly in front of his parents. However, in places where they were absent, my father was always harsh, contemptuous, and mocking toward my uncle. Seeing this, my uncle would just look sad, never getting angry or talking back. "Why don't you get angry?" I once asked innocently as a child. With a puzzled look, my uncle replied, "Because I really am receiving support from my parents." As a child, I accepted that reasoning, but as an adult, I think my father is receiving the same support, so he has no right to criticize. If I had understood that at the time, I would have supported my uncle. Unable to grasp it as a child, I felt uncomfortable when my father raised his voice at my uncle but couldn't speak up. It's true that the atmosphere was peaceful when my grandparents were around. Under their watch, my uncle would smile gently, and my father would hide his emotions and behave accordingly. My mother was too busy caring for my young sister and me to pay attention to the relationship between my father and my uncle. As a child, I believed these days would last forever. However, our everyday life changed unexpectedly. My grandparents died in an accident. I was 6 years old at the time. My sister and I cried bitterly, overwhelmed by deep sadness and loneliness. I clearly remember my uncle also quietly shedding tears. But what I can't forget is my father's laughter. Yes, he was laughing. Despite the death of his own parents, he never cried. Not when we rushed to the hospital, not while preparing for the funeral. It wasn't just that he was composed, it was clear to me, even as a child, that my father was not grieving. And that conviction only grew stronger. On the day of the funeral, my father was laughing secretly, thinking no one was watching. I happened to see his face in a moment, and I clearly caught his expression. It wasn't a laugh born of sadness or confusion, but a smile of genuine joy, the kind of happiness I, as his daughter, recognized. My father was inwardly pleased with the death of my grandparents. He was probably considering various financial benefits. That smile was very unpleasant, and it felt terrifying to me as a child, making me cry. Perhaps it was taken as tears for the death of my grandparents. At that moment, my uncle put his hand on my shoulder and gently stroked it with a tender gesture. My eyes were red with tears, but my uncle's eyes, while filled with sadness, watched over me with warmth. Why was this so? Despite being blood brothers, my father and uncle had completely different reactions to our parents' death. At that time, my suspicions about my father deepened. Afterwards, my father's behavior changed significantly. His attitude towards my uncle became noticeably colder, and he would say things like, "Why should I have to take care of a useless person like you? You should be grateful just to be allowed to live here," he also said. "If you can't even pay rent, I should take all the inheritance," he declared. I didn't understand it at the time. But these statements were clearly unfair. Legally, the inheritance should be equally divided between siblings, but my father tried to monopolize it. My uncle had the strength to stand up to him and could have resorted to legal action if necessary. However, my uncle chose not to do so. While showing a saddened face, he didn't argue back or claim his share of the inheritance. Worried about my uncle, who seemed to have lost his will, I asked, "Are you okay?" To which he replied weakly, with a smile, "I'm frail and things aren't going well with my job, so it can't be helped." Day after day of verbal abuse from my father worsened my uncle's frail condition, leading to weight loss and a pale complexion. Despite this, my uncle always told me not to worry, smiling at me. However, 3 months after my grandparents passed away, my uncle was ultimately driven out of the house. "You're useless. Get out," my father said, and without saying or doing anything, my uncle left. "Uncle, don't go," I pleaded in despair, tugging at his arm, but he gently removed his hand from mine, placed it on my shoulder, and said, "Don't worry. Emily, you're strong, you'll be okay even without me." "But I'm worried about you," I replied. I was worried about my uncle, who was not healthy and couldn't hold a regular job, having to live on his own. As I looked at him with tears in my eyes, he said, "It's okay," and left. The farewell from my uncle was deeply saddening, but there was nothing a young child like me could do. Furthermore, I myself was soon in a situation where I couldn't afford to worry about others. 2 years after my grandparents passed away, the 8-year-old me was attending elementary school regularly, and my 6-year-old sister Sandy was about to enter elementary school as well. It all started when my mother mentioned that Sandy had been praised for being very smart in kindergarten. "This intelligence must definitely be inherited from me," my father exclaimed excitedly, and impulsively decided to have her take an IQ test. We were all astounded by the results. An IQ of 150. This is my DNA. The impressive number IQ 150 was displayed. Although I couldn't fully comprehend what made this so incredible, I understood that my sister was exceptionally gifted. "That's amazing, Sandy." He. "Thank you, big sis." When I casually praised her, she smiled joyfully. Those were truly happy times. But that was as good as it got. The developments that followed were the worst. "All right, let's have her take entrance exams," my father decided. So soon. My mother was surprised, but she was pushed by my father's unfounded confidence that if she's talented, it will be fine, and she got excited too. From then on, my sister began attending tutoring every day. Since my mother accompanied her, household chores were often neglected. As a result, the responsibility was shifted to me. "Since your mother and Sandy are busy, you'll take care of the house," I was commanded. Thus, doing laundry and cleaning became part of my daily routine. After school, I had no time to play. I had to go straight home and finish the chores, or I would be scolded by my parents. Days began to appear where I would skip meals because I hadn't done the chores. "You're a failure, we can't spare time for you," I was scolded. "Why can't you get perfect scores?" was a routine scolding from my father for my grades in the 90s. "Really, can't you be a bit more like your sister?" my mother said. Even if I scored high on tests or came out on top at sports day, my parents neither praised me nor paid attention to me. I was just continually ignored. "Be like your sister, Sandy," was like a mechanical repetition. Moreover, they would add condescending words such as, "It's impossible for you, but Sandy is a genius. You're just incompetent." Sandy indeed had talent, and she made remarkable progress in a short time at tutoring, quickly passing the entrance exams. As a result, my parents became even colder towards me. They spared no expense on Sandy. I couldn't get new clothes and had to make do with ones that had become too small. Sandy could enjoy delicious meals. I got leftovers. Sandy was taken on trips. I had to stay home and watch the house. My parents clearly favored only Sandy. "This child has a promising future. She'll secure our old age," my father boasted. "Should we make her a doctor, or perhaps a lawyer? Becoming a politician wouldn't be bad either," my mother pondered. "We're really lucky to have such a talented daughter," my father said proudly. My existence went unnoticed by my parents, and me, crying behind Sandy, continued to be overlooked. Then, when I was 10 years old, my parents made a cold declaration. "One child is enough. We don't need a failure like you. Sandy needs a lot of money to bloom her talents, so if you can pay the monthly rent of $1,000, we might reconsider," they said. What I was bewildered. "We're saying that one child, Sandy, is enough," my father continued. "That's impossible. What am I supposed to do alone?" I said. "Why don't you try contacting your uncle for now? We'll give you some pocket money. Figure it out on your own," they said, handing me a little bit of money, and I was driven out of the house. I cried and banged on the front door, asking to be let back in, but there was no response. The door remained closed. In despair, I headed to the station. Even at the age of 10, I had the necessary knowledge and could take the train. I asked people for directions and finally arrived at the apartment where my uncle lived. When the bell rang, my uncle came out, showing the same kind face as always. He looked surprised but invited me inside, and when I explained the situation, my uncle showed his anger. "What are they doing?" my uncle exclaimed. I wasn't being scolded myself, but I was tormented by guilt for being forced out. Not knowing what to do next, tears welled up in my eyes. At that moment, as I looked down, my uncle gently placed his hand on my head. That hand, memorable for its size and warmth, was full of compassion. "It must have been hard, but don't worry anymore," my uncle said. "But what should I do now?" "As you see, I'm prone to illness and have little income, so I'm poor," my uncle said with a wry smile as he looked at me. Although we had lived apart for a while, my uncle's expression had grown much stronger than before. Perhaps there had been some change in his feelings due to the distance from my father. Looking directly at me, my uncle said with a smile, "I'm poor, but if you don't mind, Emily, I really want to be your parent. I'd like to become your foster father. I might not be very reliable, though." Before he finished speaking, I had already jumped into my uncle's broad chest. It was similar to my father's, yet entirely different. That chess gave me a great sense of security. You don't have to worry about anything anymore. Hearing that, I cried with relief, and my uncle gently stroked my back, comforting me. It felt like he was treating me with the deep love of a real parent. After that, I was raised by my uncle. As my uncle was indeed poor and often ill, life with him was not straightforward. However, there were always smiles in our home, and the laughter that I had forgotten while living with my parents returned in abundance with my uncle. It was a poor yet warm household indeed. My uncle continued to give me boundless love. With deep gratitude in my heart, I lived each day to the fullest. Whenever I tried hard, my uncle always praised me. Even if the results weren't great, he valued the effort itself. Encouraged by this, I worked even harder. Gradually, I began to forget about my parents who had never praised me. I grew up healthy under my uncle's care, and before I knew it, 20 years had passed. I am now already 30 years old. And now, there is a familiar face in front of me. Dad, Mom. It's been a while, Emily. Have you been well? My father says with a smile, fading from my distant memories. My eyes, directed at my father who has aged significantly and whose hair has thinned, show undisguised coldness. And for good reason. It's a "what do you want now" kind of situation. Unperturbed by my icy gaze, my father suggests, "Well, let's let bygones be bygones and get along as a family from now on." My reaction is predictable. What are you talking about? Get along as a family? You must be joking. Figures. A failure always has a bad attitude. Can't be helped. Maybe it's time to re-educate you. That's enough. Please go back home. I firmly stopped my father as he tried to enter the apartment. At that moment, my mother joined in, fueling the conflict. "Emily, don't be stubborn and accept our help. You surely can't be happy living in such a run-down apartment," my mother blurted out. "You have nothing to do with this. Please leave." "No need to be so haughty. Come on, let us in." "No, just go home." "Let us in." "Go home." Even though they've aged, they pushed with more strength than I expected. Maybe it's because there were two of them, which made it hard for me to push back. We kept shoving each other like kids playing push and shove, but I managed to stay calm until the moment my father tried to step over the threshold. That's when I gave them a hard push back. "Who?" "Ah." The force sent both my parents tumbling onto the ground, landing on their backsides. I ended up standing above them, looking down. "Ugh, you're so annoying. What did you just say?" "I'm busy, so can you just leave already?" What kind of way is that to talk? How do you even see us as your parents? I haven't considered you my parents since the moment you threw me away. But we took care of you until you were 10. Until 10, huh? If there's any time I can say I was actually taken care of, it was only when my grandparents were around. Yet you survived, didn't you? That doesn't give you the right to act all high and mighty. As they struggled to stand up while holding their backs, My parents looked much smaller. Even though they're in their 50s, they already seem like they're in their 60s or 70s. You're the ones who said it yourselves, didn't you? That Sandy was enough. With your genius daughter, there's no reason for you to come see me now. Well, it's not so simple anymore. At my words, my father grimaced and responded in an irritated tone. Did something happen to Sandy? What? Did she end up in need or something? She became a lawyer. Well then, there's no problem, right? That's amazing, just what you'd expect from someone with an IQ of 150. Oh, or so we thought, until she suddenly disappeared. That's quite surprising. As I listened further, it turned out that Sandy had successfully graduated from law school, went to grad school, took the bar exam, and although she didn't pass on her first try, she eventually did and became a fully licensed lawyer after her training. So why would she go missing after all that? She left a note saying, "I won't be taking care of you two," and then she just vanished. That's a tough situation. So in short, she's abandoned you. Congratulations. There's nothing to celebrate. That ungrateful child, after all we did to raise her, this is how she repays us. Well, I guess that's what happens when true love is lacking. While my parents may have showered my sister with excessive attention, it likely felt like nothing more than suffocating control to her. Parents who change their behavior based on an IQ score. Parents who burden their children with unrealistic expectations. Parents who disguise their selfish desires as affection. It's no wonder my sister grew fed up with that environment. Actually, the company went under. Well, given the times, that's not surprising. We barely got any severance pay, and the unemployment benefits are about to run out. That's great news. It's not great at all. It's hard enough trying to find a new job at our age. That sounds rough. Their obvious frustration only made me smirk with disinterest. That's why we want you to take care of us. The sudden demand wiped the smile off my face. No. What did you say? How can you just abandon your parents like that? The only real parent I have is my uncle, who has taken care of me since I was 10. What? My response left my father speechless. You knew I was living with my uncle when you came to this apartment, didn't you? So why are you acting surprised now? Do you really think of him as your father? My uncle, who gave me genuine love, is my true father. My words, which implied that parents who don't show love aren't parents, left my parents with stunned expressions. Even though he was sick and weak, my uncle still worked hard to support me. I wanted to repay his efforts, so I worked hard too. Wait, does that mean you actually have a proper job? Well, kind of. As I shrugged, my father suddenly grabbed my shoulder tightly. Let go of me. So, you're angry and a bit embarrassed too, aren't you? Please listen to what I'm saying. No need to listen. I understand it all. You were lonely, weren't you? You're sulking because only your sister got all the attention, right? But deep down, you're happy to see your parents, aren't you? Stop creating your own story. Don't worry, from now on, we'll be proper parents and stay by your side. I had no idea what he was talking about. Could it be that my father is already showing signs of dementia? For a moment, I stared blankly at my parents, and their ridiculous expressions made me burst out laughing. Why are you laughing? Is it because you're happy? Haha, not at all. Just so you know, in the past 10 years, I never once thought about either of you. Thanks to my uncle, I had a fulfilling life. As my parents stared at me in shock from my sudden laughter, I continued to speak. Actually, I received a scholarship to graduate from university. Oh, really? Then you must have gotten into a good company. Yes, I did. I got a job at a well-known big corporation. That's great to hear. And through an unexpected connection, I also got married. Oh, well, then I have to meet the groom and give my greetings. No, that won't be necessary. No, it's only proper that I should. That's impossible. He's currently overseas. Oh, I see. Wait, what? By the way, Uncle is also overseas. What? Your uncle too? I thought you were living here alone. I figured your sickly uncle had already. Don't go assuming my uncle is dead. He got a job assignment abroad, and since it's in a place with a good environment for his health, he went along. Now he's happily spending time playing with my kids. You have kids too. My parents were almost too stunned to process all the surprises I was throwing at them. With their bewilderment on full display, I smiled brightly. At first, Uncle wasn't keen on living together with us, but he eventually agreed. Now we're all living happily as one family. Well, in that case, we could move overseas too. Sure, go ahead. But we won't live together, and I won't be taking care of you. You're free to do what you want with your own money. That's impossible. Are you really going to abandon your parents? You're the ones who abandoned me first. My patience finally snapped at their selfish demands. My parents' faces turned pale. I have no gratitude toward you for anything, but I owe a great deal to my uncle. From now on, I intend to repay him for all he's done for me. That may be so, but at least send us a little money. Please. Uncle never touched the money I sent him and continued to live in this old apartment the whole time. But now, he's finally agreed to leave here and live with us overseas. I'm just here to finalize the paperwork. What? On the very last day of leaving this shabby apartment, the fact that you two show up, what a coincidence. Wait, what? You're leaving. The process is already done. I'm just returning the keys and then I'll head back to our home overseas. What about us? Are you just going to leave your mother and me behind? My father asked in shock, and I nodded clearly. Thank you for abandoning me. I said that with a smile, leaving them speechless. Truly thank you. Because of you, I'm happy now. With those words, I walked past them. How does it feel to be abandoned by the daughter you once threw away? I asked one last time, but there was no response. Without waiting for an answer, I left. It felt like this was the final goodbye to my real parents. After that, I returned to my home overseas. Throughout my life with Uncle, I worked hard and persevered. That effort paid off, and I secured a job at a reputable company. Later, I got an opportunity to work abroad, and it was there that I met the man I married. Uncle shed tears of joy as he celebrated our union. Soon we had children, and we invited Uncle to join us, and now we're all happily living together as a family. My husband, our children, and of course Uncle too. And I hope I can meet someone wonderful like you did, Big Sis said my sister, who stood beside me, smiling as she watched the kids play in the garden. Don't worry, you'll find someone great. You're finally free from our parents' control, I reassured her with a smile. That being said, I really need to get used to this new job, my sister said. Why not try getting a law license in this country, I suggested. I'm not interested in being a lawyer. I've had enough of doing what our parents wanted. I want to take on a job that I truly want to do, she replied. You're right, I agreed. Right after our parents abandoned me, a letter from my sister arrived at my uncle's house. In it, she described how she was suffering under the excessive expectations and pressure from our parents. After discussing it with my uncle, we secretly arranged to meet my sister on her way home from school. We kept in touch without our parents knowing. My sister wanted to live with us, but with my uncle's financial situation, it was impossible for him to support both of us. More than that, our parents would never allow it, so my sister endured living with them until she became an adult and could plan her escape. It was a tough ordeal, but she overcame it and finally gained her freedom. While our parents were distracted, celebrating her success as a lawyer, she moved out and became independent. Of course, I was there to help her. Although she secured a job here, she's struggling to adapt to the new language and environment, but I'm sure she'll be fine. There's no one more resilient and hardworking than my sister, who withstood the strict upbringing of our parents, so she'll adapt quickly. On the other hand, although I was worried about Uncle said he's planning to attend a language school, I told her, and she nodded with a smile. That's great. It's never too late to learn. His health has improved a lot, so he should enjoy life more now. You're absolutely right. Our parents quickly ran out of money after they selfishly squandered the inheritance. Even though they continued to invest in my sister, they eventually lost their jobs. When they sold the house, they were left with very little, as it was tied up with home improvement loans. They've been asking relatives for financial help, but everyone has responded coldly, leaving them to live in poverty. I heard from a relative that arguments between them are constant. I believe there should never be favoritism between siblings or unfair treatment of one's children, I said, reflecting on the past. You're absolutely right. Once again, my sister nodded in agreement with my words. No matter what happens, I'll always be here to support you, Sandy. You've already done more than enough. Thank you so much, Big Sis. Seeing how much my sister had grown brought tears to my eyes at that moment. What do you mean by support? Suddenly, I felt a gentle hand on my shoulder. It felt slightly smaller than before, but still warm. I turned around, squinting as I smiled. Thank you. Huh? As I turned, I saw my uncle standing there, looking surprised at my words. I smiled warmly and said, "Thank you, Dad. I love you."